Felix Caldwell tightened his grip on his worn-out jacket as the cold wind bit through the thin fabric. It had been another long day at the construction site, and his body ached from the grueling labor. But exhaustion was a luxury he couldn't afford. His 5-year-old daughter, Rosie, was waiting for him at home, and rent was due in a week. As he turned the corner onto a quieter street, he noticed a woman standing alone near a dimly lit bus stop. Her arms were wrapped around herself, her coat hardly enough to keep out the biting cold. She glanced over her shoulder, her expression uneasy as a few men loitered nearby, eyeing her in a way that made Felix's protective instincts kick in. "Are you all right?" he asked, stepping closer. She startled slightly before meeting his gaze. Her eyes, deep blue and filled with hesitation, searched his face as if assessing whether he was a threat. Up close, she was stunning, her delicate features framed by waves of dark brown hair. She hesitated, glancing at the men down the street before looking back at him. "I missed my driver. I was supposed to get picked up, but I don't feel safe waiting here alone." Felix nodded, understanding immediately. "Where do you live?" "I'll walk you home." She hesitated again, then let out a breath. "It's a few blocks from here if you really don't mind." "Not at all," he said firmly. "Let's go." As they started walking, she cast a few nervous glances behind her before finally relaxing a little. Felix walked slightly ahead, keeping an eye on their surroundings, his broad frame acting as a shield between her and the street. "I'm Lillian Avery," she said after a few moments. "Thank you for this. I don't usually need help like this." "Felix Caldwell," he introduced himself, "and don't worry about it. No one should have to feel unsafe getting home." She glanced at him, curiosity flickering in her eyes. "You don't seem like the kind of guy who roams the streets looking for people to help." Felix huffed a quiet laugh. "No, I'm usually too busy working or chasing after my daughter to go around saving strangers." Her eyebrows lifted. "You have a daughter." "Rosie, she's 5. "Smartest kid I know." Lillian smiled at that. "She's lucky to have a dad who cares so much." Felix's expression softened. "She's my whole world." They walked in companionable silence for a moment before Lillian gestured toward a towering building up ahead. "This is me." Felix slowed to a stop, glancing up at the massive glass structure. It screamed wealth marble steps, a doorman in a crisp suit, and warm golden light spilling from behind the grand double doors. He tried not to look too surprised. "Thanks again, Felix," Lillian said, turning to face him. "Really?" "Anytime," he said, giving her a small nod before stepping back. She hesitated, then reached into her purse. "Here, let me." Felix's expression hardened. "Don't." Lillian blinked. "What? I didn't walk you home for money." She studied him for a long moment, something unreadable in her gaze. Then, instead of offering him cash, she smiled. "Then how about a coffee as a thank you?" Felix hesitated. He should say no. His life was complicated enough without adding some wealthy stranger to the mix. But then he saw the sincerity in her eyes, the way she wasn't looking at him like some charity case. "All right," he said. "Coffee sounds good." Lillian's smile widened, and for the first time in a long while, Felix felt something stir in his chest, something warm and unfamiliar. Felix wasn't sure what he had expected when Lillian had invited him for coffee, but it certainly wasn't the sleek, understated cafe nestled on a quiet side street. The place was warm, filled with the rich scent of espresso and freshly baked pastries. It wasn't flashy, but it had the kind of quiet elegance Felix associated with people who never had to check a price tag before ordering. Lillian led the way to a corner table near the window, where the soft glow of streetlights cast a golden hue across the polished wood. She slipped off her coat and settled into the chair across from him, her movements graceful in a way that made Felix more aware of the roughness of his own hands, the worn fabric of his jacket, the calluses on his fingers. "I don't think I've ever seen you around before," she said, studying him with open curiosity. "Do you live in the neighborhood?" Felix shook his head. "A few blocks away, nothing fancy." Something flickered in Lillian's expression, but she didn't push. Instead, she gestured toward the counter. "What do you like? My treat." Felix hesitated. He wasn't the kind of man who let others pay for him, but the way she said it made it clear it wasn't a matter of charity. It was just a simple gesture. "Black coffee," he said. "No sugar." Lillian's lips curved slightly. Straight to the point. She stood and made her way to the counter, exchanging a few words with the barista before returning with 2 steaming cups. Felix accepted his with a quiet nod, inhaling the dark aroma before taking a cautious sip. "So," Lillian said, wrapping her hands around her cup. "You said you work a lot. What do you do?" Felix exhaled slowly. He couldn't imagine she'd find his life particularly interesting, but he answered anyway. "Construction. Mostly contract work, whatever pays the bills." Her gaze flickered over his hands, taking in the roughness, the faint scars. "That sounds like hard work." "It is," he admitted, "but it's honest work, and it puts food on the table." Lillian nodded, something thoughtful in her expression. "And your daughter, Rosie, right?" He felt a familiar warmth at the mention of her name. "Yeah. She's got more energy than I know what to do with, loves art, always drawing something, thinks the world is full of magic." He exhaled a quiet chuckle. "I try to keep it that way for her, for as long as I can." Lillian's expression softened. "That's really beautiful." Felix shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. "It's just being a dad." She tilted her head slightly, studying him. Not every dad would say that. Something about the way she said it made Felix wonder about her own father, but he didn't ask. Instead, he took another sip of his coffee, letting the warmth settle in his chest. "And you?" he asked after a beat. "What do you do?" Lillian hesitated, as if considering how much to reveal. "I help run a company." Felix raised an eyebrow. "What kind of company?" She smiled slightly, stirring her coffee. "A little bit of everything. Investments, real estate, hospitality." Felix nodded slowly, sensing there was more to the story than she was letting on, but he didn't press. He had a feeling she wasn't used to people asking about her work for any reason other than what they could get out of it. Silence stretched between them, not awkward, but heavy with unspoken thoughts. Felix found himself watching her, the way her fingers traced the rim of her cup, the way she seemed both at ease and slightly guarded at the same time. "You don't seem like the kind of woman who usually gets stranded on a street corner," he said finally. Lillian let out a soft laugh. "You're not wrong. My driver was supposed to pick me up after a meeting, but I got distracted and lost track of time. By the time I realized, he was already gone and my phone was dead." She shrugged. "Bad luck, I guess." Felix smirked faintly. "Good luck for me. Otherwise, I wouldn't be sitting here." Lillian's expression shifted, something unreadable flickering in her eyes. "I suppose that's true." For a moment, there was nothing but the quiet hum of the cafe around them, the clinking of cups, the low murmur of voices. Then Lillian sat back, her gaze steady. "Felix," she said, "what would you do if you didn't have to worry about money?" The question caught him off guard. He frowned slightly, considering. "I don't really think about things like that. But if you did," she pressed. Felix exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "I guess I'd make sure Rosie had everything she ever needed. A good school, a safe home, maybe take her on a trip somewhere, let her see the world." He shook his head, a little embarrassed. "Not exactly a grand dream." Lillian's gaze was unwavering. "Sounds like the best kind of dream to me." Felix wasn't sure what to say to that. Before he could respond, Lillian glanced at the time and sighed. "I should probably head home before my assistant sends a search party." Felix chuckled. "Wouldn't want that." They both stood, and for a moment, there was an odd hesitation between them. Then Lillian reached into her bag, pulled out a small card, and handed it to him. "If you ever need anything," she said, "call me." Felix stared at the card. It was simple, just her name and a number. No company logo, no title, just her. He glanced back up at her, something unreadable passing between them. "All right," he said finally. Lillian smiled before stepping outside, disappearing into the night. Felix stood there for a long moment, staring at the card in his hand. Something told him his life had just taken a turn he hadn't seen coming. Felix stared at the card Lillian had given him for longer than he cared to admit. He had tucked it into his pocket that night, telling himself he wouldn't use it. And yet, a week later, he found himself dialing the number, not for himself, of course, for Rosie. The daycare had called that morning to say there was an issue with his payment. He had miscalculated the timing of his paycheck, and now they were threatening to drop Rosie from their program if he couldn't settle the balance by the end of the day. Felix had spent the afternoon scrambling, checking every extra job he could pick up, but there wasn't enough time. Lillian's card burned in his pocket the entire time. He hated the idea of asking for help, especially from someone like her, someone who existed in a world where money wasn't a daily battle. But when he picked Rosie up and saw how excited she was to show him the finger painting she'd made, he knew he had no choice. So now, he stood outside a gleaming office building, staring up at its impossible height, wondering if he was making the biggest mistake of his life. The receptionist barely glanced at him when he asked for Lillian. "Do you have an appointment?" "No," Felix admitted, shifting uncomfortably, "but she gave me her number." The woman arched a skeptical brow but picked up the phone. "Your name?" "Felix Caldwell." There was a pause as she relayed the message. Then her expression shifted, slightly less skepticism, more surprise. "Go to the top floor, she's expecting you." Felix stepped into the elevator, forcing himself to breathe evenly as the floors ticked higher. When the doors opened, he stepped into a space so luxurious, it barely looked real. Floor-to-ceiling windows, sleek furniture, and an air of quiet power that made him feel distinctly out of place. Then he saw her. Lillian stood near her desk, her usual polished composure in place, but there was something in her gaze when she looked at him: curiosity, maybe even concern. "I wasn't expecting your call," she said, walking toward him, "but I'm glad you did." Felix exhaled sharply. "I wouldn't have, but—" He hesitated, jaw tightening. "I need a favor." Lillian gestured for him to sit, but he remained standing, too restless to settle. "Tell me." He ran a hand over his face, forcing himself to just say it. "Rosie's daycare. I miscalculated my paycheck, and they're threatening to drop her if I don't cover the balance today." Lillian didn't blink. "How much?" Felix shifted on his feet, heat creeping up the back of his neck. "More than I have right now." "That's not an answer," he exhaled. 600. Lillian reached for her phone. "Consider it handled." Felix stiffened. "Hold on, I'm not asking for a handout." She tilted her head, studying him. "Then what are you asking for?" "A loan," he said firmly. "I'll pay you back." Lillian's lips pressed together as if she were fighting a smile. "All right, a loan." Felix knew she didn't care about the money. He could see it in her expression, the way she barely registered the number. But she wasn't patronizing him either, and for that he was grateful. She made a quick call, and within minutes it was done. Felix felt a knot in his chest loosen, though the weight of owing her something settled in its place. "Thank you," he said, voice rough. Lillian leaned against her desk. "You don't have to pay me back." Felix huffed a quiet laugh. "Not happening." Her eyes flickered with amusement, but she didn't argue. Instead, she crossed her arms as if considering something. "You know, there's a way you could settle your debt quickly." Felix tensed. "I'm not interested in charity." She rolled her eyes. "It's not charity. It's a job offer." He frowned. "What kind of job?" "My company is hosting a gala next weekend. A lot of important people, a lot of cameras. I need a date." Felix blinked. "You want me to pretend to be your date?" "Exactly." He let out a disbelieving laugh. "I'm not exactly gala material, Lillian." She shrugged, unfazed. "You clean up well enough. And I need someone who isn't going to try to impress my board members or push a business deal on me, just someone to stand by my side and not make a fool of themselves." Felix hesitated. The idea of stepping into her world, even for one night, made his skin itch. But the alternative was dragging this debt out, and he hated the idea of owing her for longer than necessary. "Fine," he said, "but just for the night." Lillian smiled, something unreadable in her expression. "Just for the night." Felix had a feeling it wouldn't be that simple. Felix adjusted the cuffs of his borrowed tuxedo, feeling like an imposter in a world that wasn't his. The fabric was smooth, far too expensive for a man who spent his days covered in dust and sweat. But tonight, he wasn't just a construction worker or a struggling father. Tonight, he was Lillian Avery's date. The gala was held in a sprawling estate just beyond the city, a place so grand it barely felt real. Chandeliers cast golden light over the elegantly dressed guests, their laughter and clinking glasses creating a hum of wealth and privilege. Felix wasn't used to places like this, but he kept his shoulders squared, refusing to let it show. Then he saw her. Lillian stood near the entrance, speaking with an older couple who were clearly of importance. But it wasn't the way she carried herself with effortless grace that caught his attention. It was the way she looked at him when she noticed his arrival. Her gaze softened, a small, private expression that made the restless energy in his chest settle. "You clean up well," she said as he approached. Felix exhaled a quiet laugh. "You sure about that? Pretty sure the valet was about to ask me to move a car." Lillian's lips curved slightly. "Well, if you ever want a career change, I'll put in a good word," he huffed. "Generous of you." She slipped her arm through his, a casual yet deliberate move that sent a jolt of warmth through him. Ready for an evening of forced conversations and thinly veiled power plays, Felix glanced around. "Sounds like a regular Tuesday." Lillian let out a quiet laugh, and for a moment, the noise of the room faded. As they moved through the crowd, Felix quickly realized just how much weight Lillian's presence carried. People gravitated toward her, their smiles polished, their interest carefully measured. She handled them all with effortless ease, but there was something in her posture that told him she wasn't entirely at ease. "You hate this, don't you?" he murmured as they stepped away from yet another conversation about business ventures he couldn't care less about. Lillian exhaled. "I wouldn't say hate, but I wouldn't be here if I didn't have to be." Felix studied her. "So why do you?" She hesitated, swirling the champagne in her glass. "Because it's expected." "Because my name means something in these circles, and if I don't show up, people start asking questions." Felix frowned. "Seems exhausting." Her gaze flickered to his. "It is." Before he could say anything else, a man approached them, a tall, impeccably dressed man who carried himself with the kind of arrogance that came from knowing he could buy his way out of anything. "Lillian," the man greeted, his tone dripping with familiarity. "You didn't tell me you'd be bringing a guest." Lillian's grip on Felix's arm tightened ever so slightly. "Felix, this is Charles Whitmore. Charles, this is Felix Caldwell." Charles barely spared Felix a glance before turning his attention back to Lillian. "I was hoping we'd have a moment to talk." Felix didn't miss the slight tension in Lillian's posture. "I'm here with Felix," she said smoothly. "Whatever you have to say can wait." Charles let out a low chuckle. "Of course. Though I must say, you do have a talent for surprises." Felix didn't like the way he said it, as if Lillian was some unpredictable puzzle he was determined to solve. Charles finally turned his attention to Felix, giving him a once-over that barely concealed his skepticism. "And what is it that you do, Felix?" Felix met his gaze evenly. "Construction." Charles lifted a brow, clearly unimpressed. "How interesting." Felix didn't bother responding. He wasn't here to impress anyone, least of all a man who looked at him like he was an inconvenience. Lillian's voice was smooth but firm. "If you'll excuse us, Charles, Felix and I were just about to step outside." She didn't wait for a response before guiding Felix toward the terrace doors, the cool night air a welcome contrast to the stifling atmosphere inside. "Friend of yours?" Felix asked dryly. Lillian sighed. "Something like that. Charles is persistent." Felix leaned against the railing, studying her. "You don't owe him anything." Her gaze met his, something unspoken passing between them. "I know." For a moment, there was only the sound of the wind rustling through the trees, the distant hum of laughter from inside. "You didn't need to do this," Felix said after a moment. "Bringing me here." Lillian's expression softened. "Maybe I did." Felix frowned. "What do you mean?" She hesitated, then exhaled slowly. "I'm tired of being what everyone expects me to be, tired of people like Charles thinking they have a right to dictate my life. Tonight was supposed to be just a way to get through the evening, but I think I needed a reminder that I get to choose who stands beside me." Felix felt his pulse slow, steady. "And you chose me." Lillian's gaze didn't waver. "I did." Something shifted, then something undeniable. Felix wasn't sure when it had happened, when this thing between them had gone from a favor to something real, but he couldn't ignore it. He reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face, his fingers lingering for just a moment longer than necessary. "Lillian." She closed the space between them, her voice barely above a whisper. "Say yes." Felix swallowed. "To what?" "To whatever this is." He didn't answer with words. Instead, he closed the distance between them, his lips capturing hers in a kiss that left no room for doubt. Lillian melted into him, her hands gripping the lapels of his jacket as if anchoring herself to him. When they finally pulled apart, she let out a breathless laugh. "I think that was a yes." Felix grinned, something light and rare settling in his chest. Yeah. I think it was. For the first time in a long while, Felix Caldwell wasn't just surviving. He was living. The night air clung to Felix's skin, crisp and electric in the aftermath of the kiss. Lillian's breath was still uneven. Her fingers curled into the lapels of his tuxedo as if grounding herself. The realization that he had just kissed a woman so far removed from his world should have sent his instincts screaming, but instead, he felt something settle inside him, a certainty he hadn't known he was missing. Lillian's expression shifted, something unreadable flickering in her eyes. She took a small step back, smoothing the fabric of her gown as if trying to regain her composure. "I wasn't expecting that," she admitted, her voice softer now, lacking the perfectly measured control she usually carried. Felix exhaled through his nose, running a hand through his hair. "Neither was I." She studied him for a long moment, her gaze searching. "Do you regret it?" The question caught him off guard. Regret, that wasn't the right word. If anything, the problem was the opposite. He wanted to do it again. "No," he said simply. A slow, almost hesitant smile touched her lips. "Good." A flicker of movement from the ballroom caught Felix's attention. Through the glass doors, guests still mingled, unaware of what had just unraveled between them, but one figure stood apart, staring directly at them: Charles. Felix's jaw tightened, his instincts sharpening at the way the man's expression darkened. Lillian followed his gaze, her posture straightening. "He's watching us." Felix forced himself to remain calm. "Let him." She let out a quiet breath before turning back to him. "I should go back in before people start speculating." Felix raised an eyebrow. "Pretty sure they already are." Lillian gave him a pointed look. "Then I should at least make it look like I left on my own terms." Felix hesitated, but he knew she was right. "And me?" She tilted her head slightly, considering. "You could stay, enjoy the open bar, or you could leave with me." The weight of the choice settled between them. Felix knew what leaving with her would mean, not just to the guests inside, but to the two of them. It wasn't just about the gala anymore. He made his decision in an instant. "Let's go." Lillian's lips parted slightly in surprise, but she didn't question him. Instead, she turned, and without another glance at the glittering world behind them, they walked away. The car ride was quiet, but not tense. Lillian's fingers traced idle patterns against the leather seat, her thoughts clearly elsewhere. Felix watched her out of the corner of his eye, waiting for her to speak first. "You know," she finally said, "I don't usually do this." Felix huffed a quiet laugh. "Pretty sure I don't either." She turned to him, her expression open in a way he wasn't used to seeing. "Then why did you come with me?" He considered his answer carefully. "Because I wanted to." Lillian seemed to weigh his words before nodding slightly. "I'm glad." The car pulled up to a sleek building, and Felix recognized it immediately, the same place he had walked her home to the night they met. He hadn't expected to find himself here again, especially not like this. Lillian hesitated before speaking. "Do you want to come up?" Felix's pulse kicked up a notch. Not because he didn't want to, he did, but because this wasn't just some casual invitation. "Lillian." He exhaled, shaking his head slightly. She studied him, then smiled faintly. "Not like that, just have a drink with me, talk." Felix searched her face, looking for any sign of hesitation, but there was none. "All right," he said. Her apartment was exactly what he expected: modern, spacious, with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city skyline. But despite the polished elegance, there were small signs of warmth: half-read books stacked on a coffee table, a throw blanket draped over the couch, a single framed photograph of a younger Lillian with an older woman who bore a striking resemblance to her. Lillian set her clutch down and walked toward the kitchen. "Whiskey." Felix raised an eyebrow. "You have whiskey?" She shot him a wry look. "I'm not that predictable," he chuckled. "Sure, whiskey's good." She poured 2 glasses and handed him one before settling onto the couch. Felix took the chair across from her, letting the silence stretch comfortably between them. Lillian swirled the amber liquid in her glass before speaking. "I left the gala because I didn't want to be there, but I left with you because I did." Felix leaned forward slightly. "That's supposed to mean something." She gave him an amused look. "A man like you doesn't believe in meaning." Felix took a slow sip of his drink, letting the burn settle. "I believe in what's real." Lillian's gaze didn't waver. "And what do you think this is?" Felix didn't answer immediately. He could have given her something easy, something non-committal, but that wasn't who he was. I think it's the start of something I wasn't expecting, he admitted. Lillian exhaled, something relieved in her expression. Me too. She leaned back, watching him with quiet curiosity. You know, when I met you that night, I wasn't sure why I trusted you, I just did. Felix met her gaze. And now, a slow smile spread across her lips. Now, I think I was right to. Felix wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he wasn't afraid to find out. And as Lillian lifted her glass in a quiet toast, he realized something. Whatever this was, it was real. Felix hadn't meant to stay the night. But after hours of conversation, whiskey, and the kind of quiet moments that settled into something deeper, he had dozed off on Lillian's couch. When he woke, the early morning light was filtering through the massive windows, casting a golden glow over the city skyline. And Lillian was curled up in the armchair across from him, fast asleep. For a long moment, he just watched her. In sleep, the careful composure she always wore had faded, leaving behind something softer. The weight of expectation and responsibility was gone, and in its place was a woman who looked peaceful, almost vulnerable. He carefully stood, stretching muscles stiff from sleeping in an awkward position, and moved toward the kitchen. He wasn't the type to linger where he wasn't supposed to, but something about leaving felt wrong. Instead, he busied himself with the coffee maker, searching through cabinets until he found what he needed. The quiet click of a door made him glance up. Lillian stood in the doorway, her hair slightly tousled, a sleepy look in her eyes. "You're still here," she murmured. Felix leaned against the counter, crossing his arms. "I made coffee." A slow, almost surprised smile touched her lips. "That's a dangerous skill. I might ask you to stay more often." He arched a brow. "That's supposed to be a warning." She moved toward him, accepting the mug he handed her. "Maybe." The air between them shifted, something unspoken settling in the space that had been left open the night before. This wasn't just about a gala anymore. It wasn't about a debt or a favor. Felix set his own mug down, watching her carefully. "What are we doing, Lillian?" She blew across the surface of her coffee before meeting his gaze. "I was hoping you'd tell me," he exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "I don't fit in your world." "I know," she said simply. Felix hesitated. He hadn't expected her to say it so easily. "And that doesn't bother you." Lillian set her cup aside and stepped closer. "I spent my whole life in rooms filled with people who fit perfectly, and I've never felt more out of place than I do with them." She reached for his hand, threading her fingers through his. "But with you. For the first time, I don't feel like I have to be anything other than myself." Felix tightened his grip, the warmth of her touch grounding him. "This isn't going to be easy." Lillian smiled, something certain in her gaze. "Nothing worth it ever is." And just like that, something in Felix let go of the doubt, the hesitation. He had spent so much of his life fighting to survive, to make sure Rosie had everything she needed, that he had never considered what it meant to want something for himself. But he wanted this. He wanted her. Weeks passed, and their worlds slowly began to intertwine. Felix found himself spending more time at Lillian's apartment, though he refused to move in no matter how many times she tried to convince him otherwise. Rosie adored her, which both terrified and reassured him. His daughter was smart, perceptive, and when she had asked if Lillian was going to be around for a long time, Felix had realized he wanted to be able to say yes. But there were still challenges. The media had caught on to their relationship quickly, and while Felix did his best to ignore the speculation, Lillian wasn't as lucky. Her company's board had concerns, her business acquaintances whispered behind her back, and Charles Whitmore had made his displeasure clear. Felix had expected Lillian to bend under the pressure, to reconsider. Instead, she stood by him without hesitation. One evening, after a particularly grueling day, she walked into his apartment, the one-bedroom space he had scrimped and saved for, and dropped a newspaper onto the table. "They're saying you're a gold digger," she said, her tone dry. Felix glanced at the headline, then shrugged. "Well, I did let you buy me coffee that one time." Lillian let out a laugh, shaking her head. "You're impossible," Felix smirked. "And yet, you're still here." Her laughter faded, and she stepped closer, sliding her arms around his waist. "Yeah," she murmured, "I am," and that was all that mattered. Months passed, and the rhythm of their lives became something steady, something real. Felix had never been a man who believed in grand gestures. His love was shown in the small things, making Rosie's breakfast, fixing the leaky faucet in Lillian's apartment without being asked, holding her hand when the world felt too heavy. But when he decided to propose, he knew it had to be right. So one evening, after putting Rosie to bed, he took Lillian to the rooftop of her building, the place where they had first stood together in silence, watching the city lights. She leaned against the railing, exhaling slowly. "I love this view." Felix reached into his pocket, his heart beating harder than it should have. "I love you." Lillian turned, her expression softening. "I love you too." He took a breath, then dropped to one knee. Lillian's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide. Felix pulled out the small, simple ring he had spent weeks choosing, something elegant yet understated. "Marry me." She let out a breathless laugh, tears shining in her eyes. "You really don't waste words, do you?" Felix grinned. "Do you really want some long speech?" She shook her head, dropping to her knees in front of him. "No, I just want you." Then she kissed him, and he knew without a doubt that he had made the right choice. The wedding was small, intimate. Rosie walked down the aisle tossing flower petals, beaming as if she had orchestrated the entire thing herself. Felix stood at the altar, his heart pounding when Lillian appeared, breathtaking in a dress that shimmered in the soft evening light. He had never been a man who dreamed of moments like this, but as she reached him, her fingers sliding into his, he understood why people called it forever. Because that's exactly what it was. And when he kissed her, with the city skyline behind them and the people who mattered most surrounding them, he knew he had finally found something he had never dared to hope for: a home.